Well, new data bodes poorly for millennials. Let's put up on the screen some of this information that Bloomberg compiled. There you can see it, a year of college for millennials versus a year of college for boomers. You can go on down that list. Owning a home, cost of a home, middle-aged net worth. Look at that, 91,000 for millennials, which are just getting into the point where middle age can actually be measured. Wealth at middle age can be measured. 113,000 for boomers. A lot of that, of course, goes back to college debt. It goes back to the recession, which is a hole that millennials are still digging out of, and then got that double gut punch with the pandemic and the pandemic recession. Obviously, the situation for my generation has been miserable. As you know, over the course of the last 10 years plus now, the double gut punch, '08 recession, 2020 pandemic, just a difficult state of affairs. And I wonder, Ryan, if you think this is a hole that millennials can actually ever financially dig out of. There was some data about 5 years back that showed maybe millennials were digging themselves out of this hole. Maybe things were going to get better, but in the whole, it's still seeming really bleak. It's seeming like this trajectory might not ever be reversed.
Well, they can improve their situation, but digging out of the hole is extremely statistically unlikely. Now, certainly, some millennials are gonna do fine, but as a generational cohort, it's a lost generation in a lot of in very significant ways, particularly financially. To have 1 in 3 millennials, living with their parents at this moment is the statistic that tells the entire story. So I came out of this earlier. I graduated in the year 2000, and people who graduated a little bit before me in the mid 90s graduated into this booming tech economy.
Right.
And you saw their careers. You'd be in college and see their careers taking off. Everybody's getting offered jobs. It was still decent as I got out. Then the March of 2000 was one of these first tech bubble collapses, which then eventually just triggered this recession in the early 2000s. And then you watched people who graduated then, 2001, 2, or 3, their career trajectories were entirely different, and not because they were less than the people who had graduated, say just 4 years earlier. And there's all kinds of this academic research that shows that if you graduate into a recession and you live through that early in your career, that it takes this huge chunk that exponentially grows year after year off of your career earnings. So millennials graduated into the worst one since the Great Depression, and then get hit with, just as they're coming out of it, get hit with the COVID crisis.
Yeah, and we talked earlier this week on the show about stagnation in male wages that actually goes, and this is comparing, people who entered the workforce in like 1967 or 69, I think it was, versus people who entered the workforce in the mid 80s. So this goes back just before millennials. I mean, these trends have been hitting Americans for longer than just the millennial generation, but it does seem like the millennial generation is feeling this most acutely. If we put that Bloomberg graphic back up on the screen, I just want to show, looking at these measures, it's pretty amazing how they line up with what our conception of, let's say, the American dream has been. Home ownership, a college education, having a comfortable net worth, and having some investments. Those are metrics, but they actually are the metrics that sort of were the foundation of what used to be talked about very sort of reverently in terms of the American dream. Donald Trump himself spoke to the concept of the American dream being dead. And I think he was tapping into something that people at the time didn't really realize. I actually still don't think powerful people who are experiencing the market economy, which has been great and has been rising and rising and rising as wages, let's say, for men have been falling. I don't think people fully grasp exactly how different the American experience is for millennials versus what it was for prior generations.
Right, and those two graphics explain what Bernie Sanders calls the political revolution. Bernie Sanders had been saying more or less the same things in his career since he got into electoral politics in the 1970s. He had been a member of Congress since 1990. Mm-hmm. And you go back and you watch clips of him, he's saying the same thing he said on the campaign trail in 2015 when he first runs for president. All of a sudden, though, it starts to resonate because people's value for these ideals of the American dream, owning a home, getting ahead, all that. It doesn't mean that they didn't still want that, but it was increasingly out of reach.
Yeah, and looking at concepts or policies like student debt erasure is interesting because there are plausible studies that suggest that would really disproportionately affect people who are doing pretty well, educated people who have good jobs and are going to get a massive amount of like Ivy League or liberal arts college debt wiped out. And actually what's interesting about that is there are some people who might be doing better than others in the millennial generation, but they are not doing better than their parents. And in the way that the American dream used to be sort of measured by, doing better than the previous generation, continuing to sort of lay this foundation and build this pyramid or climb this ladder, even people who have educations in this country, they're still in student loan debt, so they can't afford houses, or they can't afford to really invest, or their net worths are still being dragged down by the fact that they have the student loan debt. So even people who feel like they're doing pretty well, or who others feel like they're doing pretty well, relatively and relative to prior generations that had this incredible Reagan era optimism about the country, where they felt as though it was morning in America. Reagan won the youth vote twice and by comfortable margins. That just doesn't exist anymore.
Right. Yes, exactly. The key phrase in understanding our politics today is downwardly mobile. These are people whose expectations of what their lives were going to be were based on generations past of their parents doing better than their grandparents, or grandparents doing better than their great-grandparents, and they expected and were raised to feel like the world was their oyster. And so when you look at the static numbers and you say, okay, well, these people, their income of Trump supporters, or the income of Bernie supporters is $50,000 to $75,000 in the highest bracket, that seems like they're doing just fine or whatever. But if you just look at it statically in a snapshot, you might think that this isn't economic precarity expressing itself through politics. But if you understand it as the expectations of a good life not being fulfilled, in that gap is where the anger is. And that's where the political organizing on populist movements, both left and right, is.
And it's just amazing to me to watch how out of touch the media class continues to be on these issues. I mean, this is like a through line on every issue that we talk about on a day-to-day basis, and to not really have a vivid understanding of how this is playing out in terms of the rise of conspiracy theories, which we constantly, NBC News has conspiracy theory reporters who don't understand at all what's driving people to conspiracy theories. I mean, they blame it on all of these different issues when at its heart, there are really, really clear and obvious metrics that show us these kinds of things. There are also cultural things that the media class struggles to understand. But the fact that this context isn't as present in the conversation and the sort of political discourse as it should be, even after the host of the freaking Celebrity Apprentice beat the former Secretary of State for the presidency. In fact, it's gone backwards, and we continue to regress and go in the opposite direction. It's stunning, and it leaves me feeling pretty pessimistic on a day-to-day basis.
Right. Well, and the last rise of the populist movement in the late 19th century also coincided with this huge rise in conspiracy thinking. If you went back and talked to any of the farmers in the prairies in the 1880s, the tales that they would spin about why they were being screwed were, a lot of them were embedded with anti-Semitism. A lot of them were embedded with other kind of fantastical notions about which New Yorkers or which bankers were consorting with Masons and Chartists and other. And all sorts of conspiracies to fill a void because they sensed that something was wrong. They were working as hard as people had in generations past, yet things were much worse for them and were much better for these other people that they didn't know. And so something needed to explain that.
And here's the important point. That sense is directionally correct. It may have displaced explanations, but it is directionally correct. And that is what the media doesn't understand, right? They don't get that after watching nobody go to jail for what happened in 2008 and watching them like the media spend multiple years tied up in a Russian collusion false narrative. A couple of years. We had every single day breaking news on MSNBC and on all of the networks. The nightly news that a lot of people watch, and a lot of people in the media forget about the nightly news completely because they're out of touch. It's another great example of that. But they have no idea what that has done to people. And they have no idea. They still can't bring themselves to agree that they are directionally correct, that something is fundamentally and incredibly broken with the ruling class.
If you don't identify for people who the actual villains are, they'll fabricate ones and they'll attack those.
Right.
Stick with us, though. More Rising for You is coming up.